Ahead and just introduce myself here, Elizabeth, and turn it over to you. So I'm Felipe Witchker. I'm joining here from Durham, North Carolina. I run the Community Purchasing Alliance Cooperative. We're a cooperative of 75 churches and schools, mostly based in Washington, D.C. I have a years background in consulting the intersection of economics, energy, and business. And then I spent a lot of time working in kind of facilities management, sustainability, primarily for churches and schools, building this cooperative we have. And mostly spending a lot of time integrating the worlds of faith-based community organizing and the cooperative movement. And so when the Pope kind of issued the letter in May, it was, I felt the line, it says, inviting you to be protagonists of the transformation, especially personally. And I hope many also felt that call. And I hope that's part of what animated you to join us here today. And been a part of a small group with Elizabeth Garlow, and so excited the Economy of Communion to learn about the Economy of Communion and have so many folks here today from that network. And so so glad to be co-hosting this today with Elizabeth. So I'll turn it over to you now, Elizabeth.
Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Garlow. I'm a member of the Economy of Communion North America Commission, and I've spent more or less the last decade working in the field of impact investing and entrepreneurship. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., and I'm really happy to co-convene this with Felipe today. We're just so excited that you joined the conversation. We're incredibly surprised and delighted by the number of people who responded to the invitation to be here. We weren't quite sure what the result might be when we put the initial invitation out, but we're really so happy to have you. And so I think before we get started with the conversation today, just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders I wanted to offer. So the first is that we just like to invite everyone to be fully present in today's conversation. We recognize that we're experimenting here a little bit through a Zoom call. For some of you, this may be your first Zoom call. For some of you, it may be your largest Zoom call. I think it is for me. So there might be many possible distractions tugging at you for your attention, but we think this will be most fruitful if we can bring ourselves into this space and be present with one another. So in that spirit, we're going to ask that if you're not speaking, to just please keep yourself on mute today. So we'd like to kick this call off. Do we have, Felipe, do we have Casey on? Do you know?
Unfortunately, it looks like there's a little bit of technical difficulty. And
no worries.
The meeting is
we can circle back on that. Yeah. So I wanted to just share a bit of context for our interest in convening today's call. So Felipe and I are excited, essentially as two people who feel very animated by Pope Francis's call for an economy, a moral economy. We plan to attend the Economy of Francesco event in Assisi in March, but we've also been ruminating on some potential ways that we could collaborate even before the Pope issued this invitation, given some of our shared formation and interest in Catholic social teaching in the field of economics. So we felt like the Pope's invitation to enter into a covenant to change today's economy and give a soul to the economy of tomorrow just resonated on a really deep level and gives us a unique opportunity to sort of reflect on what that means, particularly within our North American context. The Pope's words really have sort of fed our curiosity and our hunger for a deeper conversation on the ways that this theological lineage, and in particular, the life and work of Pope Francis, can inspire alternative economic thought and praxis. And in particular, praxis that would embrace an integral ecology that emphasizes cooperation, that centers the dignity of the human person, and then in many ways can emerge from below to transform our values, our practices, and our institutions. So the call today is quite simply a pretty spontaneous response, born of curiosity and leading up to this event in Assisi. We recognize that many of you on this call are already shepherding this work in really profound ways. So it's our hope that really what we could do is just create some lightweight infrastructure to help guide the conversation, and in particular, bring together both scholars and practitioners in a way that's mutually fruitful. So we're trying to, as you can probably tell from a lot of the emails leading up to this, we're trying to hold a space for decentralized engagement and really embody this value of subsidiarity that we feel so inspired by. So over the course of today's call, you'll hear reflections from some folks who are really pioneering in this work. And then we're going to create, as Colin mentioned, Colin and Felipe mentioned at the outset, we're going to create some space for conversation in small groups. You don't really have to do anything. It's going to feel like you're traveling through time and space. You're going to be put into a small group in Zoom, and then you'll be brought back into the large group. And ultimately, our hope for today is that this conversation could maybe catalyze some new collaboration, some new action, We're going to let Spirit kind of guide us here and see what manifests from that. And of course, toward the end of the call today, we're going to walk you through some specific opportunities for follow-on engagement and continued conversation. So now I'm actually going to transition us to some opening reflections and introduce our first speaker, Amy Ullman. Amy is an attorney and currently a lecturer at Georgetown Law, teaching seminars in law and religion, and she's a senior research fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center as well. Amy lives in a Focolare Movement community house in Silver Spring, Maryland. She's part of the Focolare leadership team in North America, and she'll tell you a little bit about what Focolare is. I'm going to ask Amy to reflect on some of her scholarship that's focused on the church and economics, drawing principally from her experience with Focolare and the Economy of Communion initiative. So Amy, I'm going to kick it over to you if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Is this
yes?
Okay, great.
Perfect.
I'm glad.
Thank you, Amy.
I'm like technologically nervous. So
you sound great.
Okay, terrific. So first of all, it's just amazing to see all the names coming in. I'm really excited. I've been working in this space actually since the early 90s when I was in law school, reflecting on the potential for business and law to be at the service of the common good and exploring the ideas of Catholic social thought. So I guess just to think about this as almost like showing some family snapshots. And so I realized there's a very long history to the church's engagement, the Catholic Church's engagement with these questions. And there would be many, many projects. I'll focus on the Focolare's experience just because that's where my scholarship has gravitated. And so the overarching goal of the Focolare's work is to work for the unity of the human family, and it's included a number of economic justice initiatives from its inception. But a key moment was reflection with the community in Brazil on the concrete problems that were facing that community in 1991 in light of Pope John Paul II's reflections on the economy, Centesimus Annus. And then also the community's experience in developing the project probably fed in significant ways to Pope Benedict's reflections in Caritas and Veritatis on hybrids. And so just a couple kind of key features of the economy of communion: businesses sharing a portion of the profits for the direct needs of the poor, creating job opportunities for people having difficulty breaking into the job market, exploring how a culture of cooperation and transparency can counteract some of the negative dimensions of competitive environments, and then exploration of how respect for the profound dignity of everyone involved in a business enterprise might inform labor and management practices. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of poll quotes from Pope Francis's meeting with the community on its 25th anniversary, which was in February of 2017. And I think probably we have the text among the documents. And I share these just, I think, because they can apply to many, 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 many of the projects that we're engaged with together. So for example, he said to that group, capitalism continues to produce discarded people for whom it would then like to care for. And so he launched an incredibly profound challenge to the excesses of capitalism. He says, we must work toward changing the rules of the game of the socioeconomic system. Imitating the Good Samaritan is not enough. It's a huge challenge. We need to act before the man comes across the robbers. And so this kind of systemic reflection. And then he said, he really challenged directly, the economy of communion, if it wants to be faithful to its charism, must not only care for the victims, but build a system where there are ever fewer victims. Capitalism knows philanthropy, but not communion. And so a lot of our work has been exploring the deep dimensions of communion. It's simple to give part of the profits without embracing and touching the people who receive those crumbs. Instead, 5 loaves and 2 fishes can feed the multitude if they are sharing all of our life. And so there's deep reflections on kind of the nature of a culture of giving. So as the project has moved through its history, There's been increasing attention also to care for the planet, to modalities for sharing resources that also generate deep participation. And so, for example, there was a conference in Kenya in 2015 that working with young entrepreneurs for developing incubators in an incubator kind of fashion. We can find more space to talk about that. Let me also flag that many of the developments here in the US preceded the law and religion complexity that's come onto the scene with Hobby Lobby. And if anybody wants to get into those topics, that's another area of my own interest in scholarship. Just a couple notes about locally, it's fairly modest, but we do have an annual conference that brings together 50, 60 people, sometimes more. It's extremely grassroots. And I think one of our hopes is to bring together academics and entrepreneurs and grassroots people for a very lively conversation. And then maybe the last feature, Luigino Bruni is the director of the International Economy of Communion Project. And he is really helping to spearhead in a particular way the Assisi Gathering. So those are just a couple snapshots.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. That was a beautiful way to kick off. And for all of you who had trouble getting in, I think we almost broke Zoom because we had a lot of people calling in. So we've been on the phone with customer service, but I think it's addressed now. So hopefully everyone is making it in okay. Sorry about that. Amy, thank you for that. I'm going to transition next to Nathan Schneider. Nathan teaches media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. His latest book is called Everything for Everyone, and it explores the legacy and the new generation of the cooperative movement. He's also a regular contributor for America, the National Jesuit magazine. So Nathan, if you're with us, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes of reflections.
Thank you so much. It means so much to me to see this event happening and to see this community gathering. When I first read the Pope's call for the Assisi Gathering, I was incredibly moved by it, moved by his attention to young people and his call for working together to build the kinds of alternatives that young people need. And you know, the call resonated for me in a surprising way. You know, I'm often like jet setting around the world, going to things, trying to like get myself into, you know, big conversations in faraway places. But actually, when I heard that call, it struck me, you know what, we really need to bring this here. We need to make sure that what Francis is doing in Assisi in March, calling together the church and especially putting attention on young people around the economy they need, is heard in the United States. We need to make sure that this is not yet another thing that Francis is doing that Catholics here in the US and others and allies can comfortably ignore. And I think this group has an opportunity to ensure that this event is something that's heard far and wide. When I was working on my book about the history of the cooperative movement, I was, you know, I came to it not necessarily in wearing my Catholic hat. You know, I came to it working with political activists who, you know, largely thought of themselves as secular. Yet I started encountering traces of Catholic influence, not just Catholic influence, of course, but significant Catholic influence throughout this legacy that I was interested in. I was focusing on the new generation coming into the cooperative movement, but you know, over and over, I'd hear people pointing to stories that the more I looked into them, I learned had deep, deep origins in, for instance, in Catholic social teaching. And this is a tradition that goes way back to the book of Acts and holding all things in common, and, you know, Acts 2 and 4, and then this medieval concept of the universal destination of goods, which kind of suggests that, you know, that is still in the catechism, suggests that, you know, of course, in the end, in reality, all things are everyone's because God has made them. But yes, we need, you know, some sort of private property because we live in the fall. But we also have to act as if with the recognition of that universal ownership, that everything truly is God's. And that has inspired people throughout centuries to use Catholic tradition to build more communal, more solidaristic forms of enterprise. This really took hold most vibrantly in after Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, in which he called for wider distribution of ownership. And after this, you saw an incredible explosion of explorations and how to do this among Catholics in solidarity with others. So you think of people like Alphonse Desjardins, who was a journalist in Quebec, who working among his neighbors, built what became the foundation of the North American credit union system and what is now the largest financial institution in Quebec, the Desjardins credit union system. That was the model that was also imported to the United States. Jose Maria Arizmendiarrieta, who is the founder, a priest in the Basque Country, founded Mondragon, which is the largest network of worker cooperatives in the world. And it's really, you can't understand how Mondragon came to be without understanding that context of mid-20th century Catholic social thought and the ways in which he was applying that. In the United States, Father Albert McKnight, an incredible Pan-Africanist priest and activist who helped build the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and other networks for financing Black ownership of farmland in the South after World War II, and really critical figure, wrote a beautiful memoir that I highly recommend. And then the people like the Adrian Dominican sisters, who helped use their ownership of, of company stock, to help create the idea of shareholder activism towards social ends and impact investing. So our church has built some of the most important examples of cooperative economy in the world. And I think we have an opportunity to continue that tradition and escalate it through this meeting and through this, this gathering of voices and organizations. So I really look forward to working with you all on that effort and on that revival.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much for those really important points. I've had a number of questions coming in from people asking if they'll get a chance to listen to the recording. And yes, we will send the recording out to folks afterwards. So don't worry about furiously writing. You can sit here and absorb what's being shared. So building from Nathan's remarks, we're actually going to transition to Melissa Huber. She's the founding executive director of the Democracy at Work Institute. And she's really on the ground running a think and do tank that expands worker cooperatives as a strategy to address economic and racial inequality. Melissa is a really long-time leader in the worker ownership movement, so we're going to ask her to share some reflections on her work in building the solidarity economy. Melissa, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I want to thank the previous speakers, Amy and Nathan, for really grounding us in the spirit and in the values of what we're doing. I'm just going to move us slightly more into the practical and give a quick state of sort of the worker ownership field right now and highlight a few bright spots as I see them. Some quick statistics about worker owners in the US, 78% women or non-binary people. That's a remarkable statistics on female leadership. 61% people of color. There are about between 450 and 500 worker co-ops in the US. They're sort of average 9 worker owners. $12 to $15 an hour is the median wage. So these are low wage and it's occasionally middle income jobs. And we're adding about 20 to 30 new worker cooperatives a year at this point in our community. So they're growing, and I think growing in specific ways that codify our values and meet the concrete needs of people locked out of jobs and ownership opportunities in our economy. And as importantly, I think a lot of the co-ops that are forming now are focused on building the ecosystem around them and building the power of the workers within them. and are really led by worker owners. There are projects focusing on low wage and contingent workers. That's the bulk of worker co-op development happening right now. We'll, I hope, hear a little bit more about the Center for Family Life's franchising model, really aiming to make those jobs sort of aggregated and more powerful. There's a focus on leadership development and entrepreneurialism. The rapid response cooperatives that the Democracy at Work Institute has been incubating are creating pathways for young people to access work regardless of their immigration status. And then there's sort of a trend writ large in our world, which is the conversion of existing businesses to cooperative ownership as a way to preserve those businesses and save jobs. And there, an example might be the Legacy Business Fund, based in DC, partnered with Community Purchasing Alliance to help workers of color buy their businesses from the retiring owners, keep those businesses open, but also plug them into a sort of a system of support via CPA. So I see some friends on the call. I want to lift them up. The Center for Family Life, the Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative, Cooperation Works, and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives are all doing ecosystem organizing around the cooperative businesses to strengthen them and ensure their success, and also building power among workers. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of our earliest and most powerful friends, which is the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. As a recipient of support from CCHD and Catholic Church, I really want to lift up the role that the church is already playing in cooperative economic development in a really visionary and important way in the US. About 7 years ago, CCHD invested in our growth as an early stage organization, which in turn helped unlock other growth of organizations and people and policy changes and capital. And CCHD has consistently invested in projects that otherwise have little to no startup funding, but also projects that aim for systems change. We're looking at, and CCHD has really invested in grassroots-led organizations that are trying to change the way capital moves, the way technical assistance is provided. Through their National Strategic Grants Program, they not only funded us, but they've also funded the Seed Commons. I know several members are on the phone today, which is a network of small loan funds making investments in local projects. And the Carolina Textile District in North Carolina, which is looking at a sort of a place-based ecosystem approach to local manufacturing. So I think those are just some of the bright spots that I see are some really smart thinking about how to aggregate money and people in service of that communion, not philanthropy, that was mentioned earlier, and the dignity and transparency of workplaces that can provide a living and a life for people who work in and own them.
Thank you, Melissa. Those are some really bright lights, and I'm glad you've grounded us in practice. As mentioned at the outset, I think this is a bit of an art to weave together new thought and practice, so we're really grateful for your contribution. To help us close out this portion of the conversation, we have with us Brian McLaren. Brian is an author, he's a speaker, an activist, and a public theologian. He's really a passionate advocate for working with people of all faiths for the common good. And Brian's a faculty member with the Living School, which is part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he also co-leads the Common Good Messaging Team, which is part of Vote Common Good. So I think he might have some interesting insights to share around narrative building work and sort of overall systems change and transformation given his long trajectory and work. So Brian, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you all. I'm going to see if I can share this screen here. Let's see if that works. Can you all see that?
Yeah, it works perfect.
Just a couple of images to remind us that the economy has very, very real effects, even effects on our planet. A alien passing by in a spaceship would look down from year to year and see the effects of our current economy on the planet. At closer range, of course, we see the effects of the economy in an unprecedented extinction crisis. But among us human beings, these numbers to me are absolutely chilling. If you look at those numbers for a minute, 80, 61, 42, and 26. In 2015, 80 individuals owned as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity. In 2016, that number, now it was 61 individuals who owned as much as the poorest half of humanity. In 2017, it was down to 42. In 2018, it was down to 26, although I understand that a group of economists have recalibrated how poverty is measured in India and China. And they think that a more accurate number is that 8 individuals own as much wealth as half of humanity. Now, if that doesn't bother you purely on an economic level, think about what those between 26 and 8 individuals have in terms of power. Think of their power to buy and own media, social media impact, to buy social media bot farms and so on, to impact elections, to give money to politicians. And suddenly you realize that that economic power concentrated in such a small number of people creates a global oligarchy and a global plutocracy that we have never seen in human history. I wrote a book in 2007 called Everything Must Change. And when I finished that book, I came away having a kind of conversion, realizing that I think there is no greater limiting factor to human imagination than the economic system that frames our thought. And I kept wishing that there would be spiritual, religious voices. I was a pastor at the time, that would have the courage to try to counter the supremacist messages coming through our economic system. Sadly, I came to realize that even though we've all heard of Citizens United in American politics, in our religious world, there's a kind of Citizens United that the wealthiest donors end up having great influence on religious leaders, which makes someone like Pope Francis all the more significant for his courage in speaking out. But when you think about the concentration of wealth among racial minorities, religious minorities, nation states, genders, classes, and then you add to that human supremacy, where human beings suck out more and more of the Earth's resources and pump out more and more toxins, you realize that we need some message to counter these messages of supremacy. And that's where this spiritual message to me of the common good becomes so powerful. I'm working with Vote Common Good, where we're trying to invite people based on their spiritual background to make a commitment to vote for the common good rather than merely self-interest, national interest, partisan interest, or even religious interest. And of course, we find this theme of the common good in the Hebrew scriptures, Christian scriptures, Quran, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, Taoist, and other scriptures, as well as in secular humanism. And so we're trying to urge people to begin voting for the common good. And of course, that leads us then to imagine an economy for the common good. I'm so grateful for the leadership of Pope Francis. I suppose I'm a closet Franciscan as a Protestant, but when he spoke to the US Congress, he said we have to cooperate generously for the common good. He has argued more recently that we have to civilize the markets with an ethic that's friendly toward the person and the environment, recognizing that the climate is part of the common good. And of course, his prayer at the end of Laudato Si captured this so powerfully and beautifully, especially to me, the line, touch the hearts of those who only look for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. All speaking to the importance of this conversation and my gratitude to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Brian. So grateful to all of our opening speakers here. You helped frame this conversation in a really beautiful way, and I think gave us a lot of kind of fertile ground to move forward in conversation this afternoon. So thank you very much. I'm going to kick it over to Felipe, who's going to orient the group to each other and then get us ready to go into small group discussions.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Brian and Melissa and Amy. Nathan, such a pleasure. I think I'd maybe just take a moment here to take a deep breath and, what caught your attention? What phrase caught your attention from the words we just heard? And to put that in the chat here, I'd love to hear what phrase or something stuck with you as a way of beginning to transition us to more of a discussion kind of oriented space here. Another reflection question for those of you who are on the phone and maybe aren't able to see the chat here, where we have things coming like philanthropy versus communion, systemic change. For those of you on the phone, also a question here is, what did you come here seeking today? Why did you accept the invitation to be here? And to begin thinking about that question as one of the main prompts for the small groups that we're going to transition to here in just a moment. Maybe to help us transition to that space, I want to invite Casey Stanton, the Minister of Adult Faith Formation at Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, to just share a brief prayer as we begin this transition moment.
It's good to be with you all, even in this virtual space, as we seek to use technology to bring about some of God's work in the world. I'm reminded that Pentecost happened at a meeting. And so the commitment to meet, the openness to meet, this is the way that God's plans can unfold in our midst with our cooperation. And so won't you join me in a prayer? God, we ask for your blessing, your presence, your spirit to be in our midst, to guide our conversation, and to inspire our plans. Kindle in our hearts a love of you, of your good creation, and of love of one another. We ask your blessing over this time as we go forth to share with one another and to reflect on what you have called each one of us into. We ask all this in the name of the one who has come and who is coming. Amen.
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 Thank you, Katie. And Colin, so basically we're going to transition into breakout rooms, which will automatically be transitioned into in just a moment here. But before that, I wanted just to kind of point to a couple of things that'll be happening beyond this call today. So we'll have 30 minutes in breakouts, and then we'll come back to about 30 minutes in the large group. And as we kind of come back to the large group, we can share some highlights, and we have a few kind of pointing toward next steps that Elizabeth and I have begun imagining, but we really want to have this be a collaborative imagining session and a collaborative brainstorming session of what you would like to have happen over the coming year. And Doug O'Brien, who's the CEO National Cooperative Business Association, has offered an October convening as an in-person thing. We might be headed October 2020. And so if we can imagine a year of activity around the Assisi convening that Pope Francis has invited us to, that's kind of the direction we're moving, and want to see what would give you life when group and where you might encounter others. And so that's really the aim for this next period of time. And we hope that Slack can be another digital space that you can invite other friends and family and collaborators to as well over the upcoming year. So make sure you also check out the Slack link.
Felipe, can I just mention for the small group breakout? So we threw a few questions into the chat function so you can see what we're hoping to sort of frame up for you in these small group discussions. But we feel like this is a cool opportunity for you to get to know some other folks in this space. And as we had prompted you in the chat box, share with each other why did you accept the invitation to be on this call? What was it about it that energized you? How is this topic intersecting with your own work in life? And then also we'd invite you to start collaborating and thinking about what are the potential kind of collaborations, coalitions, support that you're seeking in this work to transform our economy. Some groups will have facilitators that will have notes available. If you don't have someone with a Google Doc to take notes, we would just ask you to nominate someone in your group to take notes so we can capture some of this energy and then bring it back together moving forward so we can start to foster some of those collaborations.
Perfect, Elizabeth. Colin, if you wouldn't mind ushering us to our breakout rooms now, and everyone will be there for 30 minutes, and then be brought back together at the end of those 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'll just echo. So I've never done with this with 140 people. I think it's going to work. There's groups of around 10 of you in each, and we'll have around 30 minutes. At the end of that, there'll be like a minute warning when all the rooms will automatically close. As Elizabeth shared, it'd be great to nominate 1 or 2 people to kind of share back, or if there's time. And then finally, I put myself in the chat here, but I also just be patient if you don't end up in a room. It might take a minute or 2 for me to knock people around. So in a sec, there'll be a link that says join your breakout room, and yeah, have a great discussion. We'll see you back at 30.
Colin was saying there is the Slack workspace that hope we can continue the discussion there. As people join it, I'd love to hear highlights. If there's any highlights that you like from your discussion, brainstorming, collaboration, otherwise, feel free to start chatting kind of some of them in the Slack channel or in the chat room here of what's coming out of it. Brian, I don't know if you want to just kind of share just 30 seconds kind of recap as people come back into the room here of a couple of threads that you thought about the moment we're in, the time and the urgency with Pope Francis and other things. I thought that was an interesting point.
Sure. Well, you know, for all of us who think about these problems and we realize how we have such a short time. I mean, we're like Thelma and Louise, you know, barreling across to the precipice, and all of our work is so important. Our academic work, our political work, but the time frames for that kind of change are so long. It seems to me we have this remarkable moment with Pope Francis being, arguably the most powerful religious leader in the world who gets this and has been outspoken about it. And so one of the things that strikes me is, Pope Francis isn't 45 years old, so we don't have that much time with him. And figuring out how we could leverage all of our energy to get his influence, I think that would really be a big thing. If I could wish that Pope Francis would do one thing, it would be that he would create some sort of global convening, and that one key element of that global convening would be all of the billionaires who want to be on the right side of history. In other words, the people who have enormous outsized power already, use that power for a good purpose. He could be the kind of moral convener for something like that.
Thanks, Brian. I think we've got, Alyssa, if you could just mute yourself. We're getting some background noise in from you. Thank you. I just wanted to jump in, Felipe, to say from our group, one thing that we spent a fair bit of time on was this question of scale. So how to, as we think about kind of alternative practice and where it's emerging, how do we find ways to sort of dismantle barriers to scale so that it does make its way into mainstream forms of education, policy, practice, et cetera.
Who else wants to share a highlight from their group? Michael, do you want to share a quick highlight? Or Maria Teresa, are you able to share a quick highlight from your group? Or you want to share? I see John Hakama. Go ahead, John. You're on mute, John. I can't hear you. We'll tee up Terry next, and then Casey here.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Appreciated our resident Sufi participant who's talked about the notion of intersectional circles. He said, what if we were to create amongst us something akin to a chamber of commerce? Now, a chamber of commerce is designed for the accumulation of personal private wealth. But what if we had a group of people who were committed to creating, if you will, the common good, an intersectional circle of people collaborating across issues of economics and ecology to basically create a counterbalancing structure. That was one thought. I think another excellent thought was really appreciated Michael Garanzini. Apparently they've put together a paper, 10 business school deans that talk to what their understanding is of issues of the young adults in terms of what they're looking for in a new economy. So there's a great resource there. So just a couple of points from our conversation.
Great. I want to turn to Zach from America Magazine. You had something, and then we'll turn to a couple others.
Yeah, just something I really appreciated about the breakout session was getting to meet a few different people sort of more intimately. And I think that was sort of echoed from people in our group. A couple other points that came up. We need to build some shared resources for continuing this conversation. One question that our group had was, do we need to identify some shared language or words across languages? Like questions about whether this is about capitalism or anti-capitalism or something else came up. And people were looking.
Great question.
People were looking.
Great question, Zach. And I think our hope is to use the Pope's letters framing as anyone who's animated, inspired by that as kind of a key guiding force. And I think the integrative nature of those questions that are posed there as kind of one thing. But it's a very interesting question for ongoing follow-up. And I think one project we're hoping here is a ecosystem mapping that all those who are grappling with these questions to really kind of put them together. And that's one of the things we hope we can do through the Slack. And Max, do you want to say anything about the Miro board and some of that tool you're mentioning there? And then I'll turn Casey and maybe Rachel as well. Do you want to share anything, Max?
Sure. One of the things I'm looking to be helpful on is with a kind of a large collective whiteboard and kind of spatial mapping tool that's very easy and something that we can kind of follow along and help keep discussions and progress and ideas and all of that, fresh and vibrant and visual. So I'll put a link to this tool and maybe some of the educational pieces to it in the Slack channel. Consider Slack a place for ongoing conversations. Miro, a board that kind of continues to visualize language, participants, the ecosystems, the activities, the progress, and the projects that this group goes on with. So I hope that becomes something that's useful.
That'd be great. Please throw the link in the Slack and also in the chat here. Maria Teresa, did you want to share anything, highlights from your group?
Yeah, just real concretely how the people represented the diversity of the movement that has been already growing, of course, from the mother of a Catholic worker in Portland that urged us to open our homes to people, to use our laundry rooms, and to someone building a solar home right now while he works here in Durham who is connecting with Black churches, to someone from the global office of Mary Knoll, another person from the Focolare movement, so who's a publisher. So just the gratitude for this opportunity to meet each other. And I think Susan mentioned a public statement that perhaps we could all support in preparation for CC.
Great. Great. Well, please continue to share in the chat here. Elizabeth, do you want to lift up a couple pieces and then we'll kind of move along with the agenda here?
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you to everyone who's been weighing in over chat here. It's been pretty amazing. Someone called out a number of faculty who were calling for different resources in their classrooms, especially as it pertains to relating with cooperative entrepreneurs and the cooperative movement. We had another really great point on this question of polarization. So how does this movement serve as a force to heal polarization in the church and society rather than maybe exacerbate aspects of it? And then another piece around narrative. What's the new narrative? What's the kind of narrative that we can craft and create and try to offer up in the context of what's today a pretty negative narrative around exacerbating income inequality. So thank you for everyone for sharing those little tidbits. Really beautiful.
Great. So for this, I'm going to turn to Tony, Annette, and Nathan Schneider and a couple others to give some wrap-up kind of comments and framing of some of the things they're thinking about. Tony, can I turn to you first?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Well, we had a very interesting discussion in the group, and you'll see Amy and Elias have shared some comments. I'm very glad that Father Mike Garanzini is in the group, because he is the lead author of a very important document on reforming education, the way education is taught in Jesuit business schools. This comes directly from the very top of the Jesuits and even beyond that. I think what's crucial for me is that, and as I mentioned, the way we frame economics and business, especially in the US, is still about profit maximization. It's still about maximizing utility, which is defined as subjective hedonic preferences. Catholic social teaching has this amazing tradition that we can do something differently. And Laudato Si is an incredibly prophetic document in terms of both what it has to say about the climate emergency and the socioeconomic crisis, which is namely their one crisis. That document, I don't think I'm being very controversial in saying that has not been as well received in the United States as it should have been, and as it still can be, and indeed as it must be, given everything that's going on. But I think that everything has to start with education. I'm really excited to see the combination of theoreticians and practical people here. I count myself in the former group as somebody who can barely change a light bulb, but I'm really glad that there are very practical people in this group. I don't want to. I'll stop there. For me, I think if we can develop the energy in this group to create some kind of network, call it the Laudato Si Institute, call it whatever we want to call it, Catholic social teaching, some snazzier name, definitely. But, you know, I didn't expect there'd be such a huge wave of interest in this kind of group, because those of us who've been in this CST circles for a long time have found that it's a very small group of people who know about it and are interested in it. I'm seeing signs that the tide is shifting, and the next step must be to change how education, how business is taught, how economics is taught.
Thank you, Tony.
Got to start with the basics. Thank you.
No, Tony, I'm so appreciative of your leadership too in helping change economics in business schools and Catholic higher ed. I think it's a really important initiative, and so people hopefully reconnect Slack and hopefully curating some of that work moving forward. So very grateful for that. Want to turn to Elias, who is from Solidarity Hall and has a remarkable publication there and has offered to kind of help curate some of the Slack work moving forward. Elias, take yourself off mute and love to hear a few reflections so far.
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. I'm going to see if I can throw up a few slides, if I may. Can everybody see this?
Yep, great.
Yes. You know, I think it's hard to kind of wrap your head around what exactly is this topic. So I thought just very quickly I would share some thoughts on this because it's a very broad idea, not only the economy, but integral ecology, which is now part of that conversation. So at Solidarity Hall, what we're going to be thinking about in terms of our support of this is a way to think through all of these key elements that we're talking about, this wonderful tradition of Catholic social thought. Certainly, as Peter Morin called it, the dynamite of the church. We need to blow this dynamite because it really can be very powerful. But there's several other ingredients, and what Pope Francis is talking about is not only the social thought, but also transformative practices and institutions. And we've been hearing about people, you know, already doing that on the ground today, which is very energizing. The other piece of this is that we're talking about kind of new solidarity, particularly in the American context, where, as Tony was pointing out, it's really been sort of the other guys with the money that have had the microphone. And so it's time for a new voice to get to the microphone. You know, I don't know if it can be quite as impactful as the Polish solidarity movement in the photo here, but they're a great inspiration for sort of people-led societal renewal, you know? What does this really look like? As we're hearing, it looks like local production, it looks like democratic forms in the workplace. It ranges all the way from manufacture to savings and investment. It definitely distributes wealth and ownership, and even looks as needed upward to subsidiarity in a national or federal sense. We're talking about all kinds of cooperatives. We're talking about time banks. We're talking about social enterprises, microfinance, and this is far from being a complete list. We also have some inspiration. And so many of these names will be familiar, maybe some of them not as much. Let's see, Nathan mentioned not only Father Arizmendi, but also Father McKnight. People will know Dorothy Day. Some people here certainly will know Kiara Lubick. But then there's also in Canada, Father Moses Cody, Father Jimmy Tompkins, Cesar Chavez here in the US, and so on. So there's a history here. There's a long history that we need to recover and we need to activate. And that's part of our interest at Solidarity Hall also. Specifically, and this is mostly sort of my thinking, I'm going to be interested in hearing from collaborators in terms of how our steering committee could take on some of this stuff. Do we at some point have a group statement by some combination of the organizations on the call? What can we do in terms of blogging, writing, and in otherwise kind of expanding the conversation here? It would be wonderful to create a simple kind of short document, a graphic that allows people to kind of envision what a solidarity economy looks like. And then finally, maybe a little bit longer term, what could we develop and publish that would be a kind of a handbook for base communities, cells, parish groups, anybody in the neighborhood who wants to get together and do some thinking and reading is that important first step, the visioning that you do before you attempt to build something new. So that's what Solidarity Hall wants to work on. I'm going to be involved with the Slack, and the Slack will take some of these ideas and break them up into work streams, we hope. I'm also reachable directly, as you can see there. And I hope all of you that want to follow up on those particular items will do so.
Thanks, Elias. So we put the Slack link into the chat box. For those of you who haven't used Slack before, it's a pretty intuitive tool. You just got to create an account, sign up, and you'll see different conversation threads that you can join there. But feel free to reach out to us if you're trying to get engaged and get involved and struggling to do so. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of paint a picture for a couple of things that are coming down the horizon so that you have a chance to kind of think about opportunities for future engagement. And then we'll have a closing reflection. So for those who haven't yet already checked it out, there is this Economy of Francesco global event happening in Assisi. That's March 26th through 28th. And it's really been designed for young entrepreneurs, economists, kind of alternative thinkers. The Pope is trying to galvanize a lot of energy for those who are interested in building a new economy. So there are a number of students on this call. There are a number of us who are attending this event in Assisi. We thought that we would reconvene this group for a conversation about a month before that event happens. So on February 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern time, we'll reconvene a virtual conversation. And the next conversation we have will be less kind of high level and introductory and more specific to a few work streams that we see emerge coming out of this particular conversation. And a lot of those will start to take shape in Slack, which is why we're trying to encourage you to get on there and take part in conversation there. So that'll be February 19th. We'll send around a link after this for folks to register if you're interested. Then, as Felipe mentioned at the outset of the call, we are working with a number of organizations. We're in conversation with the National Cooperative Business Association and with Georgetown University currently about convening an event in person in Washington, D.C. in October of 2020 as a follow-on to the Economy of Francesco event. And we would welcome a number of other co-conveners and organizations and individuals who would like to maybe co-host that event with us. But we think it'd be beautiful to bring people together in person, also to reflect on some of the material that maybe comes out of the Economy of Francesco event. So to help bring this part of the conversation to a close, we're going to have someone that I'm going to introduce briefly. But before I do that, I also want to mention that after we have our closing reflection, we are going to invite folks who would like to stay on the line for a sort of open brainstorm about some of these follow-on opportunities. So Elias mentioned a steering committee. There are opportunities for leadership along different work streams. And so if that feels appealing to you, if you want to engage a little bit more, you can stay on the call after our closing reflection for an open group brainstorm, and we'll wrap that by 2 p.m. So it'll be a very brief kind of 20-minute exercise. But to close this portion of our conversation, I'd like to invite Myra Jackson. Myra is a UN representative and expert on the UN Harmony with Nature platform. Today, she devotes her time and service to communities and organizations that are focused on bringing forth public policies that really center the wellness of planet and people. And it's been such a delight to be in conversation with Myra leading up to this, because it's really helped illuminate the ways that this conversation has so much intersectionality with different aspects of justice, racial, gender, climate justice. And so we're just so happy to have you all again. I want to reiterate how grateful we are that you joined this conversation. And then with that, Myra, I'll ask you to help close us out with a brief reflection.
I am going to unmute myself, and I'm proceeding as if all are hearing me. For certainly we have come today in response to Pope Francis' call. And the power of the call is backed up by creation itself. And while many of us on the call are not of the Catholic tradition, we're all touched by it. And we can call upon those larger themes of Catholicism as universalism, as universal in meaning. And this is an invitation to think beyond the box that we've been in, to think more vast in terms of the planet itself. And when I think of 2020 and the time of the call, I know that we are still processing that moment in which we all, who were born at the time that the astronauts traveled to the moon, and reflected back to us what this globe looked like in space, moving, truly alive by forces way beyond us. We know together that we're a part of something larger. And in the words ecology, economy, ecosystems is one consistent theme, and that is home. And while we're still processing the meaning of what it is to be human on this planetary body that is Earth, we can imagine that this hints at the body of Christ, and that care for the earth, as Pope Francis brings us into a real clear, resounding, felt sense of our responsibilities. We know that ecocide is an error. Pope Francis reminds us of ecocide. He instructs us that this is a sin, an error. And we know that ecocide is related to genocide, is related to everything that we see in the world that is the breakdown and degradation of life. And so this call is the clarion call to gather not only in the spirit of Pope Francis, but that which inspired Pope Francis, and that is St. Francis himself, the ecologist. So the ecologist in all of us is the one that knows what it's a part of, what it belongs to, is the larger body. And the larger body is expressing in many forms. And now we're called to discover our ability to respond. It requires a bigger imagination than we've used as a humanity so far. It's time to tie our metrics to home, not simply to GDP. This is the call. I feel in the conversations today, in some way, we're all poised to respond deeply to that call and allow it to reverberate within our homes and communities. So thank you all. We are in the midst of the deep sacrament that is the blessing of discovering our identity as larger than the nation state. With this, I say a deep amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Myra. Well, deep gratitude to the 150 of you that got on a Zoom call on a Monday. We're so excited to see the ways that the energy that's been harnessed here will unleash in the world in beautiful and exciting manifestations and incarnations. So for those of you who would like to stay on for a brainstorm on leadership roles and opportunities, we welcome that. For the rest of you, we bid you adieu and we send you off into your day. And thank you again.